All right, AP language friends. So finally, I got some time to do some FRQ3 from the 2022 exam, the prompt concerning timely decisions. So what I'm going to do in this writing workshop video is, kind of status quo, what I do with the other videos that you're familiar with. I'm going to walk you through how my students constructed this particular essay while pulling the strings of my templates. So we'll talk about the inverted and the declarative thesis as far as the introductory paragraphs go. And then in terms of body paragraphs, we'll revisit the syllogistic method. So that's one of the things that, I always talk about is the idea that with my templates, you can use them to construct all FRQs for the Lang and the Lit exam. They're uniform, they're universal, nothing changes. It's the same thing every single time. So without further ado, I'll just jump right in. So here's the prompt. Colin Powell, a four-star general and former United States Secretary of State, wrote in his 1995 autobiography, "We do not have the luxury of collecting information indefinitely. At some point, before we can have every possible fact in hand, we have to decide the key is not to make quick decisions, but to make timely decisions. Write an essay that argues your position on the extent to which Powell's claim about making decisions is valid." So one of the things we do when we break down FRQ3s is underline or annotate the diction that absolutely needs to anchor the thesis. And obviously we have to talk about decision, so our thesis should say the word decision, and there's a juxtaposition being made here between quick decisions and timely decisions. And I'm going to highlight the idea of that, the word key, the key difference, the main difference, right? So they kind of have to talk about that schism between the two and, articulate that as best they can in their thesis. So the first question is this: how do I write the introduction? So you're going to declare or invert, right? And one of the things that I always talk about when I'm working with teachers is this idea that when you're using my templates or anyone's templates, or even if you're not using templates, I think one of the best ways to demystify the writing process for students is if we assume the role of Bob Ross of composition. And what I mean by that is we should paint with our students. So show them a couple of declaratives, show them a couple of inverted. You're the expert writer in the classroom. Show them explicitly how to do it. So I think there's a huge fundamental difference between the assigning of writing and the explicit teaching of it. So, my students, are used to me getting up to the proverbial easel and canvas and saying, there's two ways to write an introduction. You can declare or invert. Here's three declarative, here's three inverted. And, you might say that's a lot of time. And it's actually the time I save on the back end grading from writing exemplars and models is pretty big. So the question, how do I write the introduction? Declare or invert, and I know several of you are familiar with my templates, so I'll go kind of quick and do a quick synopsis of this. So for the declarative thesis, you're going to begin with the thesis. So you have to talk about the validity of Powell's claim, right? His assertion. So out of the gate, just boom, drop some kind of argument with regards to Powell's thesis, So are you going to agree? You're going to disagree? You're going to qualify it? What stance do you have with regards to his comment? And then from there, you got to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background. I look for tier 2 level vocabulary I want my students to cop a certain academic tone, and by tier 2 I simply mean your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. So I run intensive word study academies during the academic year, so you'll see my students wield some pretty decent vocab, and hopefully they stay in their wheelhouse so that they don't sound pretentious or contrived. So we really work on that. And then sentence constructs. And again, I know a lot of you are familiar with my work, and I'm probably being redundant in saying this, so I'll keep it brief. And those of you that want to do a deeper dive, subscribe to the YouTube channel and go look at other videos where I unpack this a little bit more thoroughly. So Strunk and White, in their seminal text called Write It Right, make the assertion that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. And my students spent a lot of time over the academic year learning how to manipulate their syntax so that they can construct each sentence construct for the purposes of achieving voice, rhythm, and flow. And oftentimes, struggling and emerging writers will overuse the short, simple declarative sentence constructs. So you get that chop flow, chop flow, chop flow, that droning rhythm. Ultimately, I want my students to have a certain musicality to their writing. And one way they can do that is by manipulating their syntax. And then with my template, as long as the scaffolds are up and the guardrails are in place, it's going to be 4 sentences long, exactly 4 sentences long, no more, no less. So that's the declarative. The inverted, we just flip it and we end with the thesis. So in this case, we might begin with an analogy, a hook, some kind of comparative value, sprinkle in the context and background, tier 2 level vocab, sentence constructs for voice, rhythm, flow, and again, exactly 4 sentences. So it doesn't matter. So you're going to agree with Powell up top first or last. So first sentence or fourth sentence. So let's take a look at a couple of examples that my students did. So perhaps our greatest distinction as a species is our capacity for critical thought. So we have not answered, or made a statement with regards to Powell's assertion. So I'm going to assume that the last sentence is going to articulate the thesis statement. So we should anticipate an inverted thesis here. So let me take it from the top again. Perhaps our greatest distinction as a species is our capacity for critical thought. Given that mankind, on an evolutionary level, walked out of the primordial ooze, it's important to remember that the DNA of our thinking is hardwired to our primitive origins. This is at the heart of the difference between quick versus timely decision-making. Our collective history shows us over and over again the seismic difference between being rash and being calculated. So you can see there that the thesis is coming last sentence. It has a stance. It's an articulated argument. The vocab is nice in this. Really like it. Just even words like distinction, capacity, evolutionary, primordial ooze. Love that. So great voice in this. It's spunky. It's got pizzazz, but the kid's in his wheelhouse, So really like it. Words like seismic. The sentence constructs are all varied. It's exactly 4 sentences. And clearly, out of the gate, this kid has a solid foundation upon which to write the rest of the essay. It's very, very well done. Very well executed. And it's just a straight up inverted thesis. So here's another one. Knee-jerk reactions, given that they are absent of forethought, oftentimes don't fare very well. By virtue of being a sentient being, mankind is endowed with the gift of decision-making. But there are 2 kinds of decisions one can make, the instinctual and impulsive versus the calculated and well-crafted. History and literature have demonstrated countless times that the key to making good decisions is to factor in the good thinking implicit in divine timing. So let's go back to the first one and see trends here. Do you see how the last sentence, kind of like in a game of poker, shows the cards? It shows the face. I don't want my kids getting into their textual support yet, right? You just show your cards, so we can expect, if the line of reasoning is going to stay intact, that this student is going to have a couple of paragraphs or syllogistic examples where they're going to talk about history. And in the second one, they're going to talk about history and literature. So you don't, doggedly or dutifully get into your textual support in the introduction. You just show your hand, right? You just kind of front load it slightly. And this one's doing the exact same thing, inverted. All right, so context, background, sentence constructs, great vocab, kids in his wheelhouse, perfectly perfect. So thesis comes last, and they have a clear stance with regards to Colin Powell's statement. So let's take a look at one more. From everything like a perfectly placed punchline to braking to avoid a catastrophic accident, timing is of the essence. Yet, in the grand scheme of things, there are vast differences in how the clock ticks from situation to situation. While some occurrences require immediate and instinctual response, others necessitate impeccable timing and well-crafted thinking and execution. Contemporary events, politically and in the sporting world, are good indicators of this. So again, it doesn't matter where you state the thesis. You can do it first sentence or fourth sentence. And as always, you got to contextualize it. Don't get into textual support. Focus on that vocab and focus on those sentence constructs. So you can see here, like, my students are able to wield hyphens, and I didn't see in these three examples, nobody did anything like super trick-rated, but, make parenthetical statements and adjective clauses. And Strunk and White go over that, and I do workshops on that as well, just on my Nuance Academy. So that's something that I really hammer with my students. So all three executed the exact same way with the exact same template. So that's what my students are doing on all of their FRQs, but in particular the FRQ3 for the 2022 Lang exam. That's what they did. That's how they approached things. So the next question is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? And as always, nothing changes. We're going to proceed syllogistically. And just for a quick review, let's talk about the syllogistic method. So it's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. It comes from Aristotle. He ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics and debate, oration, word wrangling, being a wordsmith. And he realized, like we as composition teachers, that good speaking and good thinking have like a mathematical alignment. We call it line of reasoning as composition instructors. And in speaking as well, in oration, polemics, you have to have a line of reasoning. So you might be familiar with works like Plato's Republic, where you throw out a juicy essential question like, what is justice? And all these philosophical think tankers come to the mic and they offer their definition of justice. Each definition is a syllogism, right? It's a line of reasoning. It's very computative. So when you argue syllogistically, you go from premise to conclusion. And here's an example. If I were to say, premise number 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise number 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. So that's very cogent. That's a word that I use with my students all the time. Be cogent. Try to be cogent. Be very logical. Be very lockstep. So as we know, looking at College Board sample papers, oftentimes what students do is only present the second premise. And that's why we read things and say, oh my goodness, this is so plot heavy. It's very summative, right? It's because they're not arguing. That first premise is an argument, right? You always got to be arguing. FRQ3 is the argument paper. Even rhetorical analysis is argument. Literary analysis is argument because it's expository writing. So it's really pivotal that the students include that first premise. So in composition, it looks like this if we translate it. The first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. So up top in the thesis, the only thing that those students did was agree, disagree, or qualify Powell's statement. So now we got to say why. So why are we agreeing? Why are we disagreeing? Why are we qualifying? And my students are going to answer that or get into that why reason in exactly 3 sentences. And I'll model this for you a couple of times. So the first premise is always going to be 3 sentences. Textual support gets tricky here in the sense that the students don't have any sources, they're not reading text. It all comes from their noodles, right? And they can use anything. So they can use history, literature, pop culture, movies, personal experience, you name it, whatever comes to mind to help them support and defend their argument. And then the conclusion, and I want to be very mindful of this, the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph is the textual analysis, and that's where you link. You got to go back to the keywords in the prompt, right? So you got to be talking about timely decision making, quick decision making, and the word key, right? So in the in those culminating sentences of the body paragraph, we want to hear that diction from the prompt, from the thesis, echoed back. So students often ask me this. They're like, Mr. Kuhn, we're using templates here. So the introduction is always 4 sentences long. How many sentences must a body paragraph be? How many sentences is a syllogistic body paragraph? And I always tell them, shoot for 10 sentences, no more than 12. So when they get into the second premise on FRQ3, some kids like to go on and on and on and on and on and on and on because they're talking about things that they know very intimately and very well. And so I hard cap it at 12. So usually for FRQ3, given that there are no text involved, I like them around 10 sentences. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. You know, my big word of advice to students and to teachers is this. Get as specific as possible with your textual support. So give the details, like juicy, juicy, juicy details, and plenty of them, right? Get into the minutia. So first premise gets into the why reason, and you basically front load your cards, all right? So here is an example. It's going to take 3 sentences, articulate the why reason. There is a lot of luck and chance involved in winning championships, but oftentimes timely decisions also play a big factor. Aha, so you're going to see something. My students are going to use the diction from the prompt in the first premise and in the conclusion. It helps them sustain the line of reasoning, and it helps them stay anchored in the prompt. So that was a good tactical move right there. All right, so let's see where they go with this. Given the parity between teams, especially in the NBA during the mid to late 1990s, champions and contenders were separated by the cool and collected calculations of their coaches. Jeff Van Gundy's untimely decision to give Derek Harper the game-winning shot in the 1994 finals unfortunately set into motion decades of futility and misfortune for the New York Knicks. So one thing that I do is I always look at the first premise and say, guys, first premise is a promise. What did you just promise? And this is very clearly articulated. I'm expecting to hear some textual support about how Jeff Van Gundy chose Derek Harper to take the game-winning shot. Derek Harper presumably missed it, and the Knicks have not won a championship in my lifetime. So I'm 47 years old, and they have never won. And I know that as a New Yorker myself. So second premise begins in the 4th sentence, and this is where you give your detail. right? But you just don't want to bloviate and go on and on and on and on about the New York Knicks and Jeff Van Gundy and everything about their 50 years futility of not winning the championship. You got to focus on this particular incident here. Derek Harper, Jeff Van Gundy, 1994 finals. So get into the minutia of it. Get into the nitty-gritty detail. Despite playing in the mecca of basketball, Madison Square Garden, this storied franchise has not won the NBA championship since 1973. In Game 6 of the 1994 Finals versus the Houston Rockets, the Knicks had victory all but secure. With 13.4 seconds left, you see the detail here? This is what I'm saying to my kids, like specificity, but don't be needless or mindless about it. But got to get into the detail, know the facts. With 13.4 seconds left, Coach Jeff Van Gundy called a timeout to draw up a game-winning play. Down by just a single point, at best, all the Knicks needed to do was get one of their better shooters to the free throw line. The decision was this: give the shot to John Starks or Derek Harper. Starks, at this point of the game, had already scored 38 points and had made his last 8 consecutive shots. Harper had been sitting on the bench for the last quarter nursing a torn hamstring. For whatever the reasons, Van Gundy went with Harper, and the injured player tossed the most infamous air ball of all time. The Knicks lost the game and their best chance in nearly 50 years to win an elusive ring. That's plenty of textual support. We're nearing 10 sentences. Let's wrap it up here. So in the conclusion, you got to echo the prompt, right? Decision making and the word key, right? The juxtaposition between timely and quick. So let's look at what we have here. Van Gundy obviously put some careful thought into his decision to bench Starks, but as is clear, there are such things as untimely decisions. Unfortunately, his best thinking led to the worst possible result. Sometimes overthinking a decision will yield such an outcome. And that's perfect, right? So that was, very, very well organized, a clear line of reasoning. So if we go back, is all the textual support in the second premise germane to the promise of the first premise? And absolutely. Is it overkill at times? Yeah, perhaps. There's a great deal of detail in it. But it's not ad nauseum or anything of that nature. So they stick within the confines pretty well, and plenty of support, plenty of analysis, clear line of reasoning, well argued. So my students write 4 paragraphs for FRQ 3, for 1, 2, and 3. Every essay is 4 paragraphs: intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. So what do, for the next paragraph? Just switch the textual support. You're going to follow the exact same template. Just switch the textual support. Get into the detail. Get into the specificity. Get exact. Get precise. Stay anchored in the prompt. So let's take a look at one more, and then I'll cut you guys free. So let's bust out another syllogism. First 3 sentences. This is a different student. All right. I'm going to follow the exact same template. First 3 sentences, get into the reason why and show your cards. In many cases, timely decisions appear to be divinely governed. Do you see how we're anchored in the prompt? So you got to be talking about timely decisions at all times. Do it in the first premise and do it in the conclusion. This is especially true of the origin story of Alcoholics Anonymous. If it were not for the most timely phone call ever placed, struggling and suffering alcoholics may never have found an answer to break free from the bondage of addiction. So we're 3 sentences in, argument is clearly established. In terms of line of reasoning, we should expect a conversation about a phone call that's at the heart of the origin story of Alcoholics Anonymous. So let's get specific, right? So immediately in the 4th sentence, start the second premise, go at it. Back in 1935, Bill Wilson sat at a bar in the Mayflower Hotel in Akron, Ohio. A businessman, Wilson had been dry for 5 months, an alcoholic to the core. But his business proposition was a bust on this evening, and he was feeling destitute and down on his luck. A drink sounded real good, but he knew better. Wanting desperately not to take that first drink, he decided to leave the bar room. As he stood in the hotel lobby, he made the most important decision of his life, to pick up the phone and talk to another drunk. He knew from being sober for 5 months that by simply talking to another alcoholic, he could stay sober and curb his cravings. Bill realized that he needed to speak with another drunk. That sentence is kind of not necessary, but we'll see where it goes. He looked through the hotel church directory and found a strange name which caught his attention, Reverend Walter Tunks. Bill called Reverend Tunks and received a list of people to call. After many failed calls, he finally made contact with Henrietta Seiberling. This timely decision, do you see, like stay anchored in the prompt, to call her led to his timely meeting with Dr. Bob. That night, these two men talked for hours and kept each other sober, hence giving birth to what we know as Alcoholics Anonymous today. Right. So, lots of detail. Hopefully, it's not too extraneous. In the conclusion, got to get back to the thesis, echo the prompt. Had Bill Wilson not made the timely decision to go to any lengths to stay sober, who knows where the sick and suffering alcoholic would be today? That decision to dial the phone and ask to speak with another drunk has quite literally saved millions of lives. It is perhaps one of the most timely phone calls of all time, right? So keep it around 10 to 12 sentences. So that's how my students are manipulating the syllogistic method to construct FRQ3. So hopefully you found that to be useful. Just so you know, I got some irons in the fire at the present moment. So I think most of you know that I'll be presenting in the fall in Anaheim, California at the NCTE conference with my friends Brandon Abden and Tim Freitas. So the three of us will take the mic. One of those days during the conference. We're still waiting to hear the specifics of that. I also am doing some professional development opportunities with the National Writing Project, and I'll keep the Facebook groups aware of or abreast of those events and dates as they come. And Perfection Learning, I typically do a webinar a month with them, and so stay tuned for that. And then as the summer months approach, I'm doing a summer series that's kind of an extension of my 5-week mastermind. So I'll be emailing folks about that shortly. But in brief, I'll be doing just like 60 to 90 minute sessions on some of the hot topics that people want me to present on and do webinars on. So like my Word Study Academy, my Nuance Academy, where I teach folks how do I equip my students with all that voice rhythm flow stuff? How do you teach rule number 18 from Strunk and White? AP strategies for success, my alternative grading academies, things of that nature. So I'll keep the groups appraised and abreast of those dates as they near. So if you want these slides that you just looked at for your own classroom use, feel free to email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. And for the summer short course series and the 5-week mastermind, and I got some freebie stuff on there as well, you can visit my webpage at teachinghowtowrite.com, especially if you want any consulting or PD offerings. There's information there on that. So, all right, hope that helps. Be well, happy teaching, happy writing.